Here we go. And it's recording. And we will see if Zoom webinar chat. Oh, 19 participants. Hello, participants.
People are coming.
It's hilarious. It's this weird combination of like, it's kind of like a seance.
Are there
like I'm inviting these invisible guests. Awesome. Okay, we're gonna give the invisible guests a chance to gather.
Yeah, it is the Episcopal way.
And one thing we observed last week is, you want to start on time, but then you also don't really want to say anything for a good 10 minutes because the Episcopalians kind of stroll in at the last minute. So we'll give them a chance to populate there. Blanche says, hi, Kathy, enjoyed the Villanova talk.
Thanks, Blanche.
Thanks, Blanche. So those of you invisible friends out there, I want to remind you that we have the chat capability. Liz Fitzgerald from Austin, Greg. Hi, Liz. So please use the chat things. Tell us who you are, and it's a great way to ask questions that we can introduce into the conversation.
Yeah.
It's so awesome.
Hey, Ralph.
Oh, hi, Ralph. That's awesome. Ralph and Terry, Joanne McGrew, nice to see you. So we're going to give it another couple of minutes. So talk amongst yourselves, and we're just going to give it another couple of minutes, and then we'll begin. Okay. All right. I think we'll go ahead and begin. I think it's pretty important to start on time. We'll be at this for about an hour, give or take. And so we'll go ahead and begin. It's great to see the names of friends popping up. It's lovely to see you in name. And it's lovely to see Greg in more or less in person. So this is an experiment kind of in faith formation for the parish family of St. Martin's in Williamsburg, Virginia. And it's our second of these conversations. And we've got at least 4 more speakers lined up. So we have a little bit of a series going, and I'm pretty excited about that. Our purpose is really to have some conversations that can give us some encouragement on the journey. Like those old maps where it's beyond the known world, and then they're like, there be dragons, right? So we're kind of heading into the dragon realm. And so we're just looking for some sustenance as we head into the unknown. I'm Kathy Boyd. I'm the rector of St. Martin's in Williamsburg. And looks like we've got friends and family from all over the country joining us. So it's pretty great. I'm so happy to talk with my friend Greg Garrett, who is a friend for many years, who lives in Austin, Texas. And to all of y'all who are watching this, I want to remind you that we have the capability to ask questions or any responses. If you've watched the videos that we sent or anything that Greg says or that I say, please take part with questions. I'd like to open with a prayer as we do, and I would really like to observe the Episcopal calendar of observances. And since there's no one assigned for today, even a lesser saint, and it's almost sundown here in Virginia, we will remember someone whose day is tomorrow. Her name is Harriet Starr Cannon. She died in 1896. And Mother Cannon was the founder of the community of St. Mary, the Sisters of St. Mary. And Karen Meredith, who lives in Sewanee, will know the Sisters of St. Mary. And David and I they were well known to us. The sisters were well known to us in Milwaukee. In fact, I went on happening at a convent of the Sisters of St. Mary on the lakeshore of the northern lakeshore of Milwaukee. Mother Cannon and her sisters cared for quarantined yellow fever victims and also smallpox victims. And 4 of her sisters are known as the Martyrs of Memphis because they died during the yellow fever epidemic in Memphis. So I think Mother Cannon and her sisters are appropriate for us to observe during our own time of quarantine. So I'll offer the collect for Harriet Starr Cannon. Let us pray. Gracious God, you called Harriet Starr Cannon and her companions to revive the religious life in the Episcopal Church and to dedicate their lives to you. Grant that we, after their example, may ever surrender ourselves to the revelation of your holy will through Jesus Christ, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen.
Yeah.
So I'd like to just dive right in and introduce Greg, who is my friend. We were seminary classmates at the Seminary of the Southwest. Perhaps even more important, music playing buddies. It's always a special thing to have a music playing buddy. And your spouse, Jeannie, worked with my David for many years at St. David's. She's one of my Episcopal communicator heroes, is Jeannie. So I'd like to give you a chance to introduce yourself and maybe see if you can tell us how you describe your vocation. You are a man of many talents. And so would you say that you're a teacher or a writer, teacher of writers, or what?
You know, it's hard to separate. I mean, when you find the thing that you're supposed to be doing, it's like everything fits together. And so everything that I do is oriented around story. I'm a writer who teaches and preaches. And so, you know, I get up in the morning and I do things related to story. And sometimes that's my own writing, and sometimes it's helping other people understand what other people have written, and sometimes it's interpreting writing or exegeting a text for a sermon. But it is all kind of fitting together. And that was part of what I was learning in seminary and part of why I went to seminary. Because it became apparent very quickly that I was not going to be a parish priest, but that there were some reasons that I was supposed to be there. I was called to be there for the good of the larger church, if not for a single church. So you've actually mentioned several of the most important things about me. One of the things that I've been learning in quarantine is that what I do is not who I am. And so when we all talk about the stories of our own lives, which we're going to do later, that's, I think, one of the most important things is that we actually have the time to reflect and think a little bit about who we are. So the most important things about me are I'm a father and a husband. But then in terms of those things that I do, I'm a professor at Baylor University, where I've been for 30 years now.
Wow.
I do some things in the church. I'm a licensed lay preacher based at St. David's, where the Boyds used to be. I'm the theologian in residence at the American Cathedral in Paris, which I will not see this year. It does not look like. And I've had a long relationship with the Seminary of the Southwest that just ended about a year ago, where for many years I was their writer in residence. And it was so lovely to continue to be involved with that community that was so formational for Kathy and for me and Ralph and many other folks who have passed through there. So what I do now, and sort of why Kathy has asked me on, I think, is that I do a lot of writing and speaking about story. And some of those are familiar stories. Some of you have taken a look at some of the videos and teachings that I've done about Harry Potter. But in a larger sense, I'm really interested in all of the ways that we try to make meaning. And so those could be biblical texts, they can be texts from popular culture, they can be interpreting our own lives and the lives of the people we come in contact with. And so that is kind of my larger task here tonight is to help you think a little bit about the stories that surround us and what they can teach us. and how our stories can be a part of that healing and teaching for other people as well.
Right, right. Which, of course, is a good definition of community, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sharing our stories so that we can heal each other. So what I'd like to do is start with one of the videos that you suggested was, I believe, I can't remember which one it was, but you talked about the great British literary tradition and the fantasy and your interest in, and you're an English teacher, of course, so your interest in Tolkien and Lewis. And what I'd like to do is maybe you could talk about, I like the way you talk about universal themes and make it possible for us to sort of relate ourselves to the universe. So can you talk a little bit about the Tolkien and Lewis universal themes, and then we'll sort of work our way toward Harry Potter.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that has always interested me about the Oxford Christians, Tolkien and Lewis and Dorothy Sayers and other folks who were a part of that group, was that they were artists and scholars who took faith seriously and who took the idea of story seriously. And one of my favorite stories about C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien is about their walking around in the garden of the college where Lewis taught. And they often talk about it as Lewis's epiphany, because he had not been a person of faith. And what he came to realize is that in sort of the same way that Augustine talks about pagan literature in the Confessions, that what Augustine says is whatever is true and beautiful points us toward God. And Lewis realized as he was talking with Tolkien, and Tolkien was sort of bringing things out of him as great teachers do, that all of these great stories that he loved, these archetypal stories of sacrifice and heroism and community and giving yourself to something larger than yourself, all of those stories that he loved were realized in maybe their most powerful iteration in the stories that we tell of our faith. And for him, it was sort of like, the scales fell from his eyes and he could see that in Jesus and the life of Jesus, the life, death, and resurrection, that all of those stories that he loved, those archetypal stories, were perfectly at work.
And this is a kind of an intellectual way into the faith, isn't it?
Yeah.
As opposed to being knocked off of your horse, on the road to Damascus. He really came, he kind of thought his way into the faith.
He thought his way into the faith. And what I love about the Oxford Christians, they were super smart people. They were writers, theologians, Oxford Dons. They wrote for Oxford University Press. They were editors. I mean, they were people who had a really powerful life of the mind. And I think one of the reasons that I'm drawn to them is, as you know, I was raised in a very sort of emotional Christian setting, where you came to Jesus in a very different sort of way. Softly and tenderly Jesus is calling, and there's an altar call, and you're bawling your eyes out, and you go down, and you felt that strange quickening of your heart that Wesley talks about, and that's your way in. But what I've come to discover, thinking about both of those sort of lives, my Episcopal Anglican life and my Southern Baptist life, is that they're not really that far apart. Because in these great stories, whether it's the story of Jesus' sacrifice, or whether it's Harry Potter, or whether it's a ton of other stories that we're going to talk about tonight, you can have that movement of your mind, but you can also be powerfully moved in terms of your emotions and your human understanding. Mm-hmm. And so I had this experience this week where I was working on a master's student's thesis, and he defended this week via Zoom. But I will tell you, the last poem in his collection brought everybody on the committee to tears. I mean, like when we started talking about it, like just tears were running down our faces. And it was a powerful theological statement, but it was also so viscerally human that it connected with us in every way that you can connect. And I think that's what I love about what I do now. Mm-hmm. I get to talk with smart people, but we also get to talk about what makes us essentially human and those connections that we have.
things that matter, because we spend a lot of time in conversations where we don't really say much, and so it's conversations that matter are a real gift. I'm reminded to ask you, you might be able to, you might know the answer to this. It's something I've been looking for. Some writer, some award-winning Pulitzer, Nobel, winning writer, said one time, the more specific, the more personal my writing is to me and my particular story, the more letters I get and the more input I get from other people saying me too. Does that sound familiar?
It's very much like what Faulkner said in his Nobel Prize speech.
Maybe it was Faulkner.
And Faulkner talked about how every writer or artist creates out of their own little postage stamp of land. And so those of you who are Faulkner lovers or haters know that he wrote about his home county, essentially. But, his Nobel speech goes on to say that, I'm writing about things that are absolutely particular to me and my experience, but I'm writing about the great universal themes of human life.
Yeah, that might be, you may just have solved a mystery for me.
And if it's not the right answer, it's an answer. A right answer.
You just need somebody to attribute these things to. So I would love to talk to you about the Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia, but the thing I really wanted to get into with you was J.K. Rowling and how she has. You've said that she kind of picked up a thread from this great British literary tradition. Not writing ostensibly as a Christian, not writing ostensibly with Christian themes, but it seems like her work seems tailor-made for you as a cultural observer, and you're the kind of person who sees Christian themes in anything that, however secular it may be, you see the sacred themes in it. So I liked your video that was at the book signing about why entitled Why Harry Potter Still Matters. So could you talk about her, J.K. Rowling, and about Harry and the themes?
Yes, absolutely. And I've had the chance to kind of grow in my knowledge over the years. I've never met her. The closest I got to hearing from her was hearing from her solicitor, who wanted to know how much of her I was going to be quoting in the books. And the UK has a very limited fair use statute. And so you have to be very careful about how much of an author's work you employ. So that's the closest we got, and that's not a stirring way to think about relationship. But I have met other people who were closely connected to her, including her bishop, the Scottish Episcopal bishop, who was her bishop in Edinburgh. And he seconded what she has said, about being a churchgoer and, as she puts it, sort of modestly, in church more often than weddings and funerals. Her children have been christened in church. And one of the things that was always very interesting to me that nobody seemed to talk about it because of the whole satanic Harry Potter theme that got started by evangelical Christians early on, was she gave interviews after Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone came out, in which she talked about her plan for the book and said that basically she was retelling the Christian gospel. And nobody knew what she meant at that time. And, until you finish book 7, you don't really know.
Right.
Book 7, film 8. But the really wonderful thing about it is, you use the word ostensibly not Christian. So even though she is a person, who is in church more often than weddings and funerals, the story also had to succeed entirely separately of any Christian vision that she had for it, which, by the way, is something I am always telling my writers. Any writing or any art, honestly, that is just propaganda is not going to connect with people who don't already believe as you believe.
Right.
And so one of the things that she actually said about C.S. Lewis is she said that it was too Christian. And for all of you who love the Chronicles of Narnia, let me just apologize on Rowling's behalf, but I have sometimes felt that, that this is a little bit too on the nose. And so it is very late in the Harry Potter series before you get anything even vaguely Christian. In book 7, there are 2 Bible verses inscribed on gravestones in the little town. It's Harry's parents and Dumbledore's sister, I believe. And that's the first like real Christian content, not counting these sort of archetypal themes which get visited over and over again. But I remember her saying to MTV, of all people, those two Bible verses are the core of everything that I did in the series. And she, with incredible restraint, held back everything until the end. And then it becomes very obvious, what sort of figure Harry is. The other thing that I want to say, in addition to just sort of the thing about her identity as a Christian writer or artist, and so if we could sort of hang one thing in that first part, is that the fact that she succeeds is the most important thing about her as an artist. Thomas Merton used to say that if you are a Christian and a poet, you had better be a damn good poet, or your apostolate will be ridiculed. And so even if she weren't a Christian writer, that we could claim, those themes would be there for us, because they are archetypal themes, just in the same way that Lewis talked about.
I'm pretty sure that you and I share a love for Madeleine L'Engle, right? Who is also in this great tradition. And Madeleine L'Engle's papers, you probably know, are at Wheaton College, the great evangelical college in the Midwest. And one of my favorite, really most formative ideas, and that came from Madeleine L'Engle is in her book Walking on Water, which came out years and years and years ago. And she said that she really chafed against being called a Christian writer, right? Yeah. She did not want to be labeled a Christian writer. And her point was that it's all sacred, that there's no such thing as Christian art and secular art, and I'm oversimplifying, but she said
that's at the heart of what she's saying. Yeah,
and if it's good art, then it's sacred and it reflects the creator, right? If it's that's right. And if it's bad art, then no matter how Christian it's supposed to be, it doesn't reflect the creator. And I think that's a really wonderful point.
Yeah. Well, the second thing that I wanted to say, just from that whole idea of why Harry Potter matters, as a cultural theologian, I'm really interested in the stories that have cultural currency. So for example, a couple of books ago, I wrote a book about the zombie apocalypse, not because I particularly love the zombie apocalypse, but because it's one of the most popular post 9/11 stories in Western culture. And I was just trying to understand it, which is often why I write a book. Right. And this whole idea of why think about Harry Potter partly has to do with it's the most popular fictional narrative in all of history. Over 500 million copies of the books sold, translated into 70-some languages. There has never been a story with more cultural currency. And so for me, as a critic and as a theologian, I'm always asking why. What is it about this story that is appealing to people? And then as a theologian, I'm also asking, what does it reveal about our life of faith? And the phrase that I sometimes use it's this kind of fairy tale phrase. It's like, part of my work is laying breadcrumbs back to our tradition. And so if it's true that, as Lewis was saying, the Christian story is ground zero for many of our archetypes, then how do we understand those stories as people of faith? And I have said this in a number of interviews, and some people got really incensed about it. But I said, part of why this is such a popular story is because it is a really well-told, retold rendition of the Christian gospel and everything that's at the heart of it, everything that we believe. I've got a friend who I've done a little bit of writing with who also sort of says, sometimes we have to recognize what the culture does better than we do. And draw people's, in sort of the reverse of laying breadcrumbs, it's sort of, pointed at. It's like, that is our story. Right. Like if you want to know what a self-sacrificing hero is, come talk with me. I've got another story to layer on top of this.
So that's a great segue into something that I know is one of the ideas you like, which is, as a reader or as someone who's watching a film, I'm watching one of these great stories unfold. What is it about watching a great story that awakens something in me and that makes me see? I think you said it's like something like it's easy to see who the villain is, but you're not always able to see yourself. I mean, what is it about us and our need to understand our stories that responds to any great story, any universal stories?
And of course, every way that we tell stories operates on us a little bit differently. So when we read something, we are supplying a lot of the details. When we're watching something on stage, we are participating in it in the same sort of way that we participate in the Eucharistic event or the sermon event. Like we are at this thing that is happening. But in film, what is largely happening is we are watching people live out ethical choices and respond to conflict and dilemma. And a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years is using film as a way to talk about race and reconciliation, because those are really hard conversations to have. And what I discovered purely accidentally through some work in an Episcopal parish was that people were able to get past their initial starting points on race by talking about characters in a film. They had seen those characters, they'd seen the choices they made. They could find places of connection with them. They could find objections that they had to the things that they'd done. And that's a really interesting question. In my Harry Potter class that I teach at Baylor most springs, we talk often about the difference between the films and the novels. And that's a common argument that people have in terms of which is better. But the truth is both of them are better at something.
Right.
And so there are things like you can have a really powerful emotional engagement with Daniel Radcliffe and with whoever that is that plays Luna Lovegood, who is like, I love her to death.
I know, whatever her name is.
Yeah, because we have seen her. And it's also very similar to the thing that happens in episodic television. When we were living like this great epic of episodic drama. Jeannie and I just finished up the 3rd season of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. And it was like a loss I felt in my heart. It's like, what?
Right.
I'm not going to see Mrs. Maisel for 6 months. So there is something that's almost like participating in relationship that we get from watching, whether it's television or film.
So you said something when we talked yesterday about that I don't quite remember, so I'm hoping this sounds familiar. Something about when we watch something on film or read it in a book, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Right.
And we enter into the story maybe when the hero's entering the woods. Does this sound familiar?
It sounds very familiar.
And
it's
like
the very beginning of Dante's Inferno.
Well,
so
naturally, of course, I'm quoting Dante. But you also said that people don't always experience their lives in that. Sometimes we stay in one place, right? Yeah. So there's something satisfying about watching something resolve when in fact in our own lives, sometimes we're just stuck in the woods.
Yeah. And so when I was talking about some of the archetypal stories that I talk about, I have taken to leading off with the story of brokenness or lostness. And, at the beginning of the Inferno, the character Dante the poet has the character Dante talk about how, midway through his life, he came to himself in a dark wood and was lost and didn't know where to go. And, it's a feeling a lot of us have at this moment because we are living in this limbo. Yesterday, you and I were talking about, I don't know if this is yesterday or tomorrow. Right. And like in terms of the obvious conflicts by which we divide up our lives, we're not seeing a whole lot of resolution. But that feeling usually happens in the middle of a well-told story, in what we call the long second act of a film or a play or a novel. And it's the section where nobody in the story knows what's going to happen next. And that is the hardest place for us to live. And that's why we want to get past Lent, past Good Friday. You know, it's like, where is Easter? And one of the things that my own experience as somebody who wrestled with chronic depression taught me is that for me, in certain stages of my life, and for many people that I love, living in that brokenness or lostness can be a long-term proposition.
Right.
And, you know, it requires an incredible amount of patience from those of us who love those people and from those of us who have suffered in that sense. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things that I think is really interesting, because that is an archetypal story for us. At some point in our lives, we are all going to be lost in a dark wood. Right.
And that, of course, is one of the points along Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, right? There's that's the fire swamp in the Princess Bride, right? So then you have other things, other themes that you like that kind of come out of that acknowledgement. Our conversation last week talked a lot about brokenness and about finding our purpose and what God desires for us, somehow mysteriously in the brokenness, our own brokenness, which I know is one of your themes. But you also talk about home.
Yeah.
And could you talk about your three themes that you like?
And one of the things that you and I talked about that I think is really essential is that these themes are interlocked. They're a part of our journey, that they take place alongside each other. And they're also at the heart of our sort of sacred journeys as well. So, you know, that whole idea about home is, at some point in our lives, we're all going to be lost in a dark wood. And some years ago, I did an onstage conversation with Damon Lindelof, who is the co-creator and executive producer of the TV show Lost. And those of you who have seen the show know that it had a really powerful spiritual component. You may have hated the way that it ended, but there was this very real sense that, as Damon told me on stage, it was a show about people who were lost in every way that people can be lost. Mm-hmm. And he said, we knew that our show would find its ending point when they were found in every way that people can be found. And so there are different ways that we can tell that story, but lost and found is one of those ways. Finding home is one of those archetypal stories. But just for us, it's largely a sense of, where do I belong? And, you know, we will know that place when we get there. There's that wonderful line toward the end of, I think it's one of the four quartets by T.S. Eliot. I think it's Little Gidding, where he talks about coming to the place where we began and knowing it for the first time. Right. And so that idea of finding home, where do we belong, is an essential thing. A second thing that's tied up in that is the idea of community. Who am I supposed to be with? Who am I on this journey with? And community is an essential part of our faith stories. It's an essential part of many of the stories that we love. It's a huge part of Harry Potter, which is about an orphan who lived under the stairs.
And he kept saying, I've got to do this next thing. I'm going to go by myself. I'm going to leave y'all here. And they kept saying, no, we're your companions, right?
Well, you know, my spiritual director keeps telling me the things that I keep forgetting, which is, you know, it's the job of the people we're in community with. Because in community, we are pushed and shoved. Barbara Brown Taylor talks about how we are thrown into community to smooth each other's rough edges. I love that. I used to have one of those rock tumblers when I was a
rock tumbler. Yeah.
And you know, we are pushed to become the people that we're supposed to be, which kind of leads me into the last thing. For us to be fully human, we have to care about something outside of ourselves. Our own lives matter, but they're not everything that matters. And so you were talking about Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. Campbell said that a hero can never be a hero for him or herself. They're heroes on behalf of a community.
Right.
And one of the things I love about Harry Potter is that J.K. Rowling has this very clear sense of the difference between celebrity and heroism. You know, it's one thing to be an Instagram influencer and have 1 million followers, and you have a certain kind of power and currency. But unless you do something with that,
Right.
then it's nothing, you know?
You know, there's a moment when they're forming Dumbledore's army and they get serious about, we are going to learn, nobody's going to teach the students how to fight the evil. And they assemble, right? They assemble to sign their form to get into Dumbledore's army. And Harry finally says, look, it's not fun. It's not going to be fun. It's not pretty. It's luck. I mean, a lot of it is just luck, but so he really deflects the celebrity. They keep trying to make a celebrity out of him. He deflects
and early on, you know, in the second book, some of you will remember Gilderoy Lockhart, who's the celebrity author who is the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher that year. And he takes Harry under his wing and tries to teach him how to be a celebrity. And, you know, so Harry learns early on. I mean, Harry has been one of the most famous people in the wizarding world since his parents died and he survived. And he knows that all of that really means nothing. What he wants is to know where he belongs and who his people are, and what he's supposed to be doing. And he finds all of those things at Hogwarts. He finds them with that circle of friends, with Dumbledore's army and with Ron and Hermione. And what I love about those three archetypes, you know, the home, the community, and the heroism, is that they all fit together. Because like when you figure out where you're supposed to be, you're going to figure out who you're supposed to be with. And those are the people who are going to enable you and engage you and push you and shove you and love you. And, you know, it becomes possible to become the people that we are called to be together.
Right. Well, so say that again about you find out where you're supposed to be and who you're supposed to be with and what you're supposed to do, right?
Right.
So I heard sort of dipped into some podcasts of Krista Tippett's the other day. She does what used to be Speaking on Faith, and now, of course, her show is called On Being. Mm-hmm. And she has in the podcasts, she'll play an interview with somebody. She's talking to whoever. The only person I can think of is Mary Oliver, and I know they talked, although Mary Oliver is no longer with us. So right. She's got the interview with Mary Oliver, then she's got the uncut, longer, like 90 minutes or whatever. But then she also has these little 10-minute things where somebody calls in and they ask a question. And, hello, this is Maria from LA. I have a question. So Krista, and that's just a little 10-minute thing. So one of the questions she considered recently was, if you are so used to thinking of who you are with regard to what you do, what's your identity, what's your role, if you're not contributing to society in some way, then you're just taking up space. And the question to Krista was, in these times when we can't do anything,
right?
What does that mean? What are we left with? How do we have an identity? And so, my question to you is, are we still part of a story if there's nothing happening? Well, you alluded to this before in your own, like trying to do things.
If you think back to maybe middle school literature, you learn that there are all kinds of different conflicts. And my students at Baylor, most of my undergraduates, like to write what I think of as loud stories. So it's external conflicts, gunshots and explosions and,
bad guys.
Bad guys, good guys, but there's all of these different kinds of conflicts, many of which are internal or cosmic, And so this is not a time when many of us are getting in our cars and pushing things around in whatever sort of life that we have. So it's like, I finished my semester at Baylor, and I think it was the best semester of online instruction that I'm capable of. But, it was so low drama. I'm used to walking into a room and taking the temperature of it and seeing light bulbs go off over people's heads and participating and getting an emotional rush out of that. That for me, that's external as well as internal. But the thing about this moment, which all of the people listening to this are aware, is that it's also given us an opportunity to reflect. And we were joking earlier about not knowing whether we were living in the past or the present, but we have simultaneous existences. We worry about the future, we regret the past, we try to come to grips with decisions and actions. There are all kinds of really powerful internal conflicts that, there will be some great novels that come out of this that are not going to have explosions, and they're not going to have people walking around in the outdoors. They're going to have people digging back into their lives. I could see Margaret Atwood writing like this tremendous novel about somebody who figures out something from when she was 10 years old that she has never been able to get her fingers around.
Yeah, I've read that across society, people are having dreams that are just over the top, that everybody's having over the top dreams.
Yeah. And that, that obviously is something for us to pay attention to. We have really vivid interior lives at this moment. And, I have not had that luxury for much of my adult life. I was telling you yesterday, and this sounds so melodramatic, but the more I've sat with what I said to you, the more I believe it. I told you yesterday, I have run from myself my whole life. And that sounds like something so sad, but it's also true of so many of us. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that has been really phenomenal about this moment in time is, for 45 days, I have not been able to run from myself. And I have had to figure out who it is, like looking back at those questions, like, who am I? What am I supposed to be doing? What does heroism look like? Heroism at my house right now is being a non-anxious presence for my daughters who are just freaking out, and that seems like such a quiet thing. It's like just not losing my own mind.
Right. Are you familiar with the movie Stranger Than Fiction?
Oh, yeah.
With Will Ferrell?
Yeah.
Right.
Genius.
So Will Ferrell is an IRS agent, and he starts one day out of nowhere hearing someone narrating his life, right? Mm-hmm. And so as he tries to investigate that, a person that he goes to for advice, an English professor, college English professor, tells him, first of all, you need to figure out if you're living in a comedy or a tragedy.
What kind of story are you in?
Right.
It's the same thing that Alistair McIntyre says in After Virtue, but it means more when we hear Dustin Hoffman say it.
Yeah, so good. So good. And the idea of conflict, Dustin Hoffman tells him, conflict moves the story along. So, look at that, look at what conflicts are moving you along. So here we are stuck at home, no external conflicts, plenty of weird dreams, starting to feel a little stir crazy. Yeah. What kinds of things do you imagine, what kinds of fiction, what kinds of writing exercises or something do you think might help us individually focus our attention on the opportunity that we're in?
Well, one of the things that I think is really useful if we need to identify what kind of story we're in is to kind of think about those broad archetypes. I've got a good friend who's getting divorced right now, and he can't finalize the divorce because the courts are closed. And so he is living in this strange in-between place in the same kind of way that many of us are living in strange in-between places. And so knowing that he is in between, like he and I had a conversation a couple of nights ago, and I was just like, this is where we are. There is nothing you can do about this. It's not a problem that can be solved. Right. Recognizing that you are in between and you don't know the ending of the story is knowing something about the story and knowing something about yourself.
Right. It's a thing, isn't it? The threshold is a thing.
The threshold is a thing. And I think when we think about those three other archetypes, you know, I am lucky enough for the first time in my life to have found home. I mean, not in like in terms of a faith community. I've been very lucky to have been rescued by amazing faith communities. But as you know, and some of our friends know, my personal life has not been a very happy one for most of my life. And now all of a sudden here in my declining years, I am home.
Twilight, you're Twilight.
After my years, I'm in quarantine with the people I love most in the world. And that's an amazing thing. Like, to know that about my life tells me something about the story.
To be conscious of it, right? So there's a mindfulness, there's an aspect of mindfulness.
Yeah.
Like, be mindful of what you are living. Don't just wish it would go away, right? Or hunker down. I've never heard so many people say hunker down in my life.
Yeah.
Because
like,
you can't.
Whatever the living into the hunkering might feel like. Because hunker down is like, you know, get in the trench and put your helmet on and let this pass over you.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the wrong thing we should be doing.
Right.
It's like, we may never have an opportunity like this again.
Right.
And like my spiritual director, I was always reminded, like, we forget the things we need to know most. So I think one of the things that's really useful for me in this moment is that this has been a time to really exercise my faith. I am so used to, and many of the people who are listening to us and you are competent people who are used to solving problems. And this is just, there is nothing in control for me.
You know, may I interrupt? I think you remind me of something I thought of a minute ago that I wanted to say. An opportunity really to get into the questions of your faith.
Yeah.
To really ask yourself, do I believe this? So many of us, our faith is kind of a performative thing.
Right.
Right? So it is our job to be articulate about the faith and to help other people with their stories and their faith, right?
Right.
So there's a vulnerability in facing what it is that you actually believe, because people need to know what we believe. Yeah. It's not just a performance anymore, because we don't have the trappings to count on. We don't have the church trappings to hide behind.
Yeah. Where's my candle? Where's my beautiful window? Where's my altarpiece? Or
in the words of VeggieTales, where's my water buffalo?
Yeah.
Where's my water buffalo?
My water buffalo. And if you have been wrestling with this, you who are listening to us, then please know that you are in such good company. On Easter, I yelled at every person in my house. It was not my day of being the calm presence, because like I just kind of lost my mind. It's like, it's Easter. I cannot believe we are not, we are not able to live out the most sacred moment in our calendar. And
well, so that's the question. If we can't go to church, we can't do church, is Jesus still risen from the dead?
Yeah.
And if the answer is yes, then it turns out we weren't the ones making it happen.
I am preaching via Zoom next week at the American Cathedral in Paris.
Oh,
so I am prepping Easter 6, which is the first Paraclete reference in the Gospel of John. And in that tiny little lection for 2 Sundays from now, basically each of the 3 persons of the Trinity, and of course it's very primitive even in John's Gospel, but each of the 3 people of parts of the Trinity basically promises to show up for us. Mm-hmm. And in Jesus's promise, I will not leave you orphans. Mm-hmm. I have been relying on that. Even though I have not had the physical sacraments since March the 1st, I have relied on that presence. And one of the things that I've been talking about and writing about and maybe this has been a useful way for me to wrestle with this for myself, but doing some theology for other people. Those are not the only sacraments. You know, we believe that God manifests God's self in so many ways. And, you know, tonight we're talking about great stories and art and literature. But honestly, just to look around my house and to see those beautiful girls, I can't not believe when I see that.
Right. Which, you know, we'd be remiss, we're getting a little bit towards the top of the hour, but we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about music. You and I share such a bond for music. We've done a lot of performing together. In fact, speaking of Easter, you and my daughter Claire and I have done a couple of Easter shows at St. David's. So talk about a couple of songs. And one of the things that we share is a love of particular songs which have been there for us, have shaped us. You know, one of the things that music does for us is gives us something that so that we know we're not alone, right? We're not the only ones. And of course I have my favorites. So talk about some of the songs that have meant a lot to you. Maybe you've sung them, you've performed them yourself.
Yeah. Well, one of the songs that you and I used to play is by the Austin singer-songwriter Bob Schneider. And
fantastic Bob Schneider. I
was doing a long interview on BBC Radio some years ago. And they, out of the blue, and Kathy, you may remember this story, but they asked me if I could pick a song to play in the break that represented my life. And now everybody's going to start thinking about what that song would be for them. You've got to wait 5 more minutes at least before you do that. But the song that I picked was this song by Bob Schneider called A Long Way to Get Back Home. And it's a song that mostly lives in that place of brokenness and lostness, you know, where we don't know where we're supposed to wind up.
Right.
But the refrain keeps coming back to, and a long way to get to before I get back home. Mm-hmm. And those of you who have studied literature or pay attention to verse or song lyric know that when you repeat something, it becomes more and more important. It goes from being a particular to an abstract.
A long way to get before I get back home.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's a song that's been really important for me, and I still play it. A lot of times when I go out and do speaking things, I'll, carry the guitar over one shoulder. And, as Kathy and I both know, even if everything else you do is crap, they'll remember the guitar. That was awesome.
Right. Right.
And then the other, and because many of you from Williamsburg, I'll just tell you, one of my all-time favorite singer-songwriters is Bruce Hornsby. I have written a number of my novels to the music of Bruce Hornsby. The epigraph for my second novel, Cycling, comes from one of his early songs called Lost Soul. And he and I have talked about it, and it was based on a relative of his who committed suicide, who was in that broken place. And the novel that I just finished, the epigraph, is from another of my favorite Bruce Hornsby songs called Fortunate Son. And it's this song about male strength, or what we perceive to be male strength, which is not allowing yourself to feel. I was always taught well to be the strong one and keep it inside. But sometimes I just sit beside the freeway and howl out into the dark, dark skies. Mm-hmm. And that's how I have often felt as a man in America, growing up in the American South. And it's how most of the characters that I write my novels about feel, they're in that place where they don't know where they belong. And one of the things that I think has been really useful, my son Chandler and I have also talked about this, and each of you knows it, but there is music that is God sent for you at this moment. And one of the things, I'm posting a ton of stuff on social media in an attempt to be in some way useful. And what I keep reminding people is don't forget what you love. Do the things that you love. Listen to the people that you love. Watch a movie that you love. Jeannie and I watched Casablanca again the other night.
Right.
Never not good.
Never not good. There's always the hope that one could be the first lady of Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
So there's something that we can encourage people to do is maybe find music that is new that might help. I don't know if you've heard Mary Chapin Carpenter's The Things That We Are Made Of album, mm-hmm. which is just wonderful. It's just wonderful. It's about the journey through life and the traveling along and what it means to travel, and listening to music with good lyrics can really get you through a time.
Yeah, and I noticed that Ralph was mentioning John Denver, listening to you and David Sagano playing, which I also miss. I loved it. One of the great joys of being at Southwest was that we had a bunch of really lovely voices, and we got to sing together.
Yeah, we fancied ourselves the house band, which reminds me of our beloved friend Reed Morgan, who is no longer with us, and you wrote a song which remains one of the great songs of all time for Skit Night, because Reed was one of these people who could not wait to get into a collar. He wanted nothing more than to wear a black shirt. And you wrote a blues song about that, about Reed and waiting to slap, you like close the windows, right? I draw the shades. Do you remember this?
Draw the shades and put that bad boy on. Yeah, the white clerical collar.
Oh, so beautiful. It's music,
Yeah. Well, I think that there's definitely something to that, and so there are all sorts of consolations, and some of those fit together. I was listening to Springsteen's "Born to Run" while I ran through the forest the other day, and it was just like almost too much.
Yeah.
But almost too much is just about enough right now.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Well, so one final thought, which may be one of the great themes that we haven't talked about, of course, is the struggle between good and evil, right?
Yeah.
Within ourselves, you got the bad guys, out on the mean streets, but then you also have the struggle of light and dark, the angel and the devil on your two shoulders, right?
Right.
Would it be an overstatement to say that this time we're in is a battle between good and evil? Is that an overstatement? Or are there elements of that in what we're living with?
Oh, it certainly feels to me like that, at least in terms of how we define. If we think of good being our willingness to love our neighbor sacrificially, and to step outside of what is good only for ourselves or for our families, then it certainly feels that way. I mean, the whole toilet paper thing, and to any of you who bought a bunch of toilet paper, I apologize. I know it was only a larger symptom. It was not a spiritual failing on your part. But it was a symptom of our fear.
Yeah.
And, one of the things, and David Boyd will remember this, but we used to talk about this a lot at St. David's, about trying to live into a spirituality of abundance, because it's so easy to live in that spirituality of scarcity. The God who provides, the God who feeds, the God who loves, there's a line in one of my books, and I'm going to quote myself, but I really love the one way that I said this, because I compared God's love and grace to this mountain river that I was trying to dam with little stones. And it's like, there's no way. It's too powerful. It will break through. It can't be held back. So I would love if we could faithfully live into that. The whole cosmic good and evil thing can get appropriated for political purposes too easily.
Right.
And, I think I know in my own life who I think the bad guys are, but some of those people are people that I love, and I can't sort of think in those kind of reductive us and them sort of terms.
Right.
So if we could think in a broader sense, what are the common values to which we aspire, and tell those stories and remind ourselves.
In big ways and in little ways, within our own homes, in our Zoom meetings,
in our larger communities. I mean, in all of our exchanges, in every way that we interact. If we could, I don't know. You remember my friend Zane Wildman? The way we close every conversation with each other is big love.
Mm-hmm.
If we could go out and do big love.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to stop. That's a great goal. It's a great goal. I'm so grateful to you for sharing your thinking. You know, you and I have had these conversations before, but it's so beneficial to me. It seems so beneficial to share that with others who are at home looking for things to think about and, you know, trying not to chew their foot out of the trap, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
I wonder, I'm springing this on you, but you grew up a Baptist, so surely you can do this. I'm wondering if you would close us with a prayer and a benediction of some sort.
I would be honored to. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you all for joining us. Let us pray. Holy One of blessing, walk with us through this time of uncertainty. You have promised not to leave us orphans. Give us the strength and courage to love as you love. We ask all this in Jesus' name, who lives and reigns with you in the Spirit, one God, now and forever.
Amen. Big love to all of you who have tuned in and watched. It's great to see Ralph Morgan's name on my screen. My beloved seminary classmate,
Yeah.
who is still, you know, just like you, still living in the old country in Texas. So lots of love. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye, Greg.
God bless.
Thank you. Bye-bye.